Welcome into today's video in our Catholic Perspective series, where we look at some of our favorite movies, TV shows, and books, which is what we're doing today, and try to look at them through a Catholic lens. I am Taylor Schroll, and usually I'm alone, but I needed help today because I read my third ever C.S. Lewis book, so I thought I'd bring the master of C.S. Lewis. Everyone literally calls him this. Mr. David Bates of the Pints with Jack podcast. Hello, David.
Hello, Taylor. How's it going?
I'm doing great. You are the host of the Pints with Jack podcast, and you start almost all of your shows by saying, "Are you drinking anything today?" So, are you drinking anything today?
Well, just in celebration of July 4th, I'm having a nice cup of tea that didn't get thrown into any other water than hot water.
And it's a mug that hasn't been smashed. Congratulations. It's a rare artifact.
Yeah. It's funny. It's actually normally my wife's cup. So I'm the first one up in the morning. So I make the tea and I always serve her tea in this cup. I think just bit by bit, I'm just making her more British.
Yeah. No, she's American. We won the war. Okay, let's talk about C.S. Lewis. So I read Mere Christianity. So just my history with Lewis is I read I read Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe when I was a kid, and then I watched the movie, watched that movie, and then the other, one or two like mainstream movies, and then they just gave up and stopped. So I gave up and stopped. That's essentially how it was for me. But I read Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe as a kid. I read Screwtape Letters when I was in college, and that has been the most impactful spiritual book outside of the Bible that I've ever read. I don't reread any books. I don't rewatch any TV shows. I don't rewatch any movies. Screwtape Letters I recently reread a couple of years ago and just got even more out of it. So that's kind of my history with Lewis. But then I've been producing and editing your podcast for a few years now, and y'all are always trying to convince people to read Lewis. And I didn't tell you this until I was done, but I finally broke down. You did this. You did this to me. I read Mere Christianity because of you.
I'm really pleased. You are certainly our number one fan who we pay to listen to our podcast.
Correct. I've listened to every second. I even listen to stuff that doesn't get aired.
It's a good thing that some of that stuff doesn't get aired.
Yeah, exactly. What most people don't know is that actually every one of y'all's recordings is 4 hours long, and I edit it down to about an hour.
Exactly. Andrew goes on a diatribe about Till We Have Faces, is C.S. Lewis's best book. Matt starts talking about AI and things that interest him, and he just likes to make up words. So all that gibberish has to get cut out.
And you do fake history where Britain won the war. So it's a grand old show. You can find it wherever you listen to podcasts. So how I want to dive into this first is essentially how I typically do these Catholic Perspective videos is I have some kind of like top 10 list, or essentially it's just like, these are just thoughts that popped out of me while I was reading the book. I write them down on my phone and then I pop on and I talk about them. But typically, if it's something like Star Wars or Marvel, it's something that I've been steeped in for years, or at least Screwtape Letters. It's like I've been steeped in, battling temptation my whole life. Like it wasn't a huge leap for me, but this one, it felt like it was more of a leap. Like I did feel like I was a little out of my depth at times. Like there's some things that are very basic and some things that are a little more in depth. So I just want you to give us an overview for maybe those who haven't read it or it's been a long time. What is Mere Christianity? What's like the main thing that Lewis is trying to do here?
Mm-hmm. So it was written by C.S. Lewis, and if you're ever in a pub quiz, the C.S. stands for Clive Staples.
What a loser.
And if you were called...
C.S. was a great choice.
If you were called Clive Staples, you'd shorten it to C.S., or as Lewis did as well, his friends called him Jack. It was just a name that he decided to call himself from a very young age, and that's what all of his friends called him. He lived between 1898 and 1963. And every year we celebrate his birthday on C.S. Lewis Reading Day, November 29th. And his backstory is that he was raised in the Church of Ireland, and he fell away from Christian faith as an adolescent for a number of reasons. The problem of pain and suffering was certainly one of them. And also he loved myths, and it seemed like Christianity was always let off the hook because he was always told that all of the Greek and Roman and Norse myths, that was made up. Christianity was true, and no justification was ever given to him. But he then returned to first theism, so belief in God, and then Christianity in his early 30s. And he was then a member of the Church of England until his death. he had lots of important friends, but one of them that your viewers will have certainly heard of is J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of The Lord of the Rings.
Jolkin, Rolkin, Tolkien. That's what his stands for.
That's the guy. That's the guy. And you can thank Lewis for The Lord of the Rings, because Tolkien says, I'd have never finished it. For the longest time, he was my only audience, and he was the one who kept at me to actually finish it. And if you know anything about Tolkien, the guy was great at starting, not great at finishing. And speaking of books, Lewis, he wrote between 30 and 40 books, depending upon how you chop them up. But he wrote across a vast range of genres. He did the Chronicles of Narnia, which you could call a fairy tale, Out of the Silent Planet, which is science fiction, and the book which we'll discuss today, Mere Christianity, which is apologetics. And this book came about because he'd written The Problem of Pain, so a book responding to the problem of suffering and evil in the world. And Lewis came to the attention of the director of religious broadcasting at the BBC, and James Welch. He asked Lewis to do a series of talks. So in the middle of World War II, Lewis was on the radio in a very well-recognized voice by the end of it. And he gave these short, they're about between 10 and 15-minute talks. And at the end of it, the BBC received such great feedback that they then published the transcripts of them in Broadcast Talks, Christian Behavior, and Beyond Personality. So they're 3 separate books, but then they were all collected together in 1952 under one volume, one title of Mere Christianity. And before we get into some of its contents, I grew up on Narnia, all of it. I was a huge fan. There's pictures of me with my plastic toy lion, who was, needless to say,
what a
called
sweet little
Aslan.
nerd.
Oh, I was such a nerd. It was great.
Was.
But true. But it was Mere Christianity that really cemented my interest in Lewis as an adult. Because as an adult, I rediscovered the Chronicles of Narnia. I thought, oh, this is wonderful. I totally forgotten all about this. But I then read Mere Christianity and then started to realize, oh, this is someone who's got more to say to me than, just fawns and satires and, traveling to distant lands. And so I'd also say this is a perfect book if anyone wants to start a book club. And if you'd like some help, we have lots of resources at pintswithjack.com. Discussion questions, sample quotations, and all things to help you lead that kind of book. But in terms of its structure, it's got 4 parts. So the part 1, Lewis is basically arguing for the existence of God. And then in part 2, he transitions from theism, so just pure belief in God, to belief specifically in Jesus and Christianity. And then in part 3, he explains Christian morality and the virtues. He actually goes through the cardinal virtues and the theological virtues. And in part 4, he gets into deep waters with the Christian conception of God. That's also worth mentioning before we get much further, is that in the preface, and if ever you read a Lewis book, always read the preface, because he tells you what he's doing and what he's not doing. And in this book, he explains what he means by mere Christianity, the fact that this is the core central doctrines of all mainstream Christian denominations that have always been believed. And he compares mere Christianity to like the hallway in a huge house. The churches and the denominations are rooms off that hallway. And he says, my job is just to get you into the hallway. He said, when I became a Christian, there wasn't much material to help people do that. And so he said, this is where the line was thinnest, and I went naturally to it. And so he says, I want to get you into the hallway. Don't stay there. This isn't its new denomination. This isn't the stopping point. But you want to be looking into those other rooms and working out what's true, what's holy. But my job is just to get you through the door, and you can go to other people from there.
Yeah, on the preface, it was one of the things I had an interesting experience reading this book, and I had this experience first in the preface because that's where it starts, but in and out throughout the book. So like I have these notes of like things that really stuck out at me as like either new ideas or core ideas, right? But then there were some other things that I'm like, this point that Lewis is making is so seeped into me that it's not like it's sticking out to me, so I need to write it down in my notes to talk about it. But then I was like, maybe this is where this came from. Because like Lewis is so ubiquitous in Christian culture, and Mere Christianity, I think y'all argue all the time about his best book on Pints with Jack. But like when it comes to popularity, my personal opinion is that this is third. I think it's Narnia and Screwtape and then this. That's just my, maybe I'm wrong, but like as the outsider's view, just popularity wise, it kind of seems like a lot of Christians that I know have read Mere Christianity, but haven't read like Problem of Pain or something like that, right? So this idea of like all Christians agree on 97% of things, and like we fight each other over all these things when really our goal is to bring more people into the hallway so that then they could come into a room. It's like, I was like, this isn't revolutionary. I was like, well, maybe it was, 80 years ago or 70 years ago, whenever he was writing this. And I was, that was one of the things that I was thinking about. It's like, maybe this is why this is not sticking out to me, because it was revolutionary then.
I think the time has certainly changed from when the talks were first broadcast and when the book was first published. We actually recently, in this last season, we read the letters between C.S. Lewis and Saint Don Giovanni Calabria, so a canonized Catholic saint. And so they talk a little bit about intercommunion issues between different Christian denominations. And you get to see Lewis's a very clear mindset that he's not going to spend time publicly arguing about these things. He says, this is for internal discussions only. He says, my job is just to get people through the door, just to get them to believe that Jesus is the Son of God. And it's you do wonder how he would have survived in today's world, the world of Twitter, where all of your hot takes must be shared personally and publicly all the time.
I don't know. He recorded these on the radio during World War II. I think he could have figured out Twitter.
But yeah, no, it's. I always find it challenging when I read what he says, because I'm a Catholic and very much a Catholic by choice, and I do think these are important conversations. But I think it's always good to be refreshed with Lewis's emphasis. His chief concern is getting people to know Jesus, and everything else is we can talk about that later.
Right. You started mentioning it, but the mere, I've seen some people not happy with the word mere. So you started explaining it, but what does he mean by mere Christianity?
It's he gets it from an earlier author, but it's basically the idea of these are core doctrines that everyone agrees with.
Sure.
In terms of Jesus' life, death, burial, resurrection, and ascension into heaven. The secondary issues, he says, I'm not going to touch it. And he says some people might think that if we sort of went down to the real core parts of Christianity that everyone agrees with, we would end up with basically, nothing, a sort of a vague sentimentalism, but nothing much more. He says, no, this is real and substantial and life-changing. And this is what he sought to explain and defend.
All right. I'm ready to start jumping into some of these things that stick out to me. Was there anything else before we start jumping into specifics? Anything else we need to know?
No, I think yeah. With that, everyone's now ready to dive in.
We're all pros now. We're all hosts of the Pints with Jack podcast. Okay. The first thing that popped out to me was pretty early in the book, because he does, like you mentioned, he talks about morality later, but he does set it up pretty early. And it's in the setup of the morality that he starts talking about a piano and the keys on a piano. And that, registered with me because of a couple of reasons. One, I'm a musician, right? And like, I set out to play all of the right notes, and like for me, it's guitar. Like I set out to play all the right notes, and every now and then, like I'm primarily a worship leader. So if I miss a note, one, it might just be because of incompetence or I'm tired or whatever. Or there have been other times where like I mess up a note because like I'm praying, like I get kind of mixed up in it. So like it happens, right? But like I'm pretty talented, so I tend to hit the notes. But even then, every now and then, I'll still. A string will break or I'll hit a wrong note or whatever. So he's comparing it to the piano, where he says something that's challenging, and I would actually push back just slightly, but overall I like the idea, where he says there's no wrong keys when it comes to the moral life. It's like we're supposed to, you can play all the white keys, you can play all the black keys, but if you're playing in the key of C major, you're only supposed to play the white key. So if you accidentally hit a black key, it's going to sound terrible because you just played a note outside of the key. And essentially, the other thing that stuck out to me is because y'all are talking about Lewis and Tolkien all the time, and how, Tolkien's myth of how the world was created was harmony and this beautiful music. And then what does Satan do? He comes in and sows the discord, and there's disharmony, disunity in these. And that's essentially what he's doing with us, like with our spiritual lives. I'm supposed to be playing in C major, hitting all the white keys, and I'm pretty good at it. But every now and then I hit an F sharp. I'm like, like that wasn't supposed to happen. So I liked that idea. So let's dive into that a little bit.
Yeah, he he in that section that you're referring to, he's responding to. Let me set up the challenge first of all. He basically makes the point that we all speak as though there is some kind of moral law. When we're doing something, when we quarrel, we say, well, how would you like that if someone did that to you? Or I was here first, why shove him? But we're basically saying that there is a standard of behavior that people are falling short of. And so what he's doing is he's building up basically the argument for morality, the idea that there is this unchanging moral law, meaning that there is an unchanging moral law giver, i.e. God. Mm-hmm. And so the section you're referring to is where he's responding to some objections to where people can see that Lewis is going. And they're saying, well, all you're really talking about is that it's an instinct, what that thing is. And Lewis says that can't be the case because it judges between other instincts. So if somebody falls into a river, I have two instincts. I have one instinct to help and the other instinct to not get involved and to run away. Right. And what he says is that the moral law tells me, oh no, you've got to go help. That's the thing you have to do. And so very often it's even telling you to increase the sentiment behind one of the instincts, typically the weaker one, because we know that we should do it. And that's when he gives the comparison to notes. And this is the one wonderful thing about Mere Christianity. He uses these pictures all throughout to help you understand what he's saying. And he says, the moral law tells us the tune we have to play. Our instincts are merely the keys. A piano hasn't got two kinds of notes in it, right ones and wrong ones. There are right ones for particular times and wrong ones in particular times. Sure. And he says, there's none of our impulses which the moral law may not sometimes tell us to suppress, and none which they might not sometimes tell us to encourage. And he speaks of the moral law as being the sheet music that you're playing with the keys that you have.
Right. And I think anybody who has been Christian has been trying to live a moral life. We've seen that in ourselves, right? This whole idea of sin darkening our conscience and how we think. It's like, I know that this is how I'm supposed to do things. And then I start hitting some wrong keys. And I'm like, you know what? It might just easier to change keys where I can play these keys how I want to, right? Because I can do whatever I want. And we start C major sounded fine, but I could also play an F sharp major. And, that's a good key too. But it's like, yeah, but God was calling me to play in C major at the time. All these sorts of things, right? I also like you mentioned the two options, there's the black and white option, I guess, pun intended with the piano analogy, but the black and white option when somebody falls into a river is to go help them or to run away. That's the good and the bad. But he also talks about how as we're growing in the Christian life, it's, literally the problem of the river. You might've heard this before of there's a baby in the river. What do? Do you go save the baby? Well, yes. Well, what happens if you're there and then it's one baby and then 8 babies and then 13 babies? It's one moral thing to do. And the person that I am, because I'm more action oriented, is I'm jumping into the pool, right? But I don't know what you would do, and you could tell, but somebody who is a little bit more analytical like you might be who's throwing these babies in the river? And your moral thing is to go upriver and to figure out where this problem is coming from, right? So even then it's even finding even more correct notes to play when because I could be mad at you because I could be why aren't you helping me? I'm jumping into the river. Why are you running away? You're I'm not running away. I'm going to see who's throwing these babies in the river, So we could even get mad at each other for where we're both actually doing the right thing, but just the right thing for us at the moment, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. And whichever action you take, and which action you take, is a matter of the virtue of prudence. Well, one who is more analytical might say this is much more prudent to get to the source of the issue rather than keep trying to jump in and swim and then eventually be overwhelmed. And then if this keeps happening, then more babies are going to die. But that's a question of prudence. But the point is that at its most basic level, we know that there are people in need that we need to help. Now, the question of how we help them, that's a separate question. And that's what politicians argue over all of the time. But the thing that Lewis is wanting to make sure that we're very clear about is that we do have a moral responsibility here. And that moral responsibility is real. It's not simply one of our instincts, and it's not simply social convention. Because if it was social convention, how could we ever say that one society's morality was better than another? So if you want to be able to say that modern American morality is better than Nazi morality, you have to believe that there's a standard towards which it is tending.
Sure.
Otherwise it's just different options among many.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. One more thought, and then we'll get into probably what is my favorite section of today's conversation, which is these hurt me quite a bit because I struggle with these things, and Lewis hit me in the chest with these. But before we get there, there's one more that's like a kind of a general idea, and maybe this is kind of a good introduction to this, because this one challenged me. Because I think a lot in like my call to ministry has been, sharing the joy of the gospel, and like how my favorite verse, John 10:10, God, he calls us to life in abundance, right? Because that's kind of a reaction from me, where like Christianity was sad and boring when I was a child. So it's kind of maybe it's an overcorrection for me, right? But Lewis says something that, like, he's talking about how Christianity starts with bad news and then comes the good news, right? And I think I've been challenged by this by a couple of people. With Lewis, there was a big a conference a few months ago that we talked about on the show, on our podcast, about how this guy shared the Kerygma, which is the good news of the gospel. And it was a 25-minute talk, and he talked about bad news for 20 minutes and then good for 5. Where, like, when I give the Kerygma talk, I do the bad for 5 and the good for 20, right? And it's just a matter of emphasis, where it's just different for different people. But I found it fascinating that Lewis, who is like clearly way better at this than I am and way more prolific at this than I am, also has this idea that I may have flipped a little bit. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, the line you're referring to is where Lewis says, it's at the end of the first part. He says, Christianity tells people to repent and promises them forgiveness. It has nothing to say to people who do not know that they have done anything to repent of, and who do not feel like they need any forgiveness. When you know you are sick, you listen to the doctor.
Mm-hmm.
And I think emphasis and balance is important here. And I'd say more than anything else, in terms of your audience. When you know who your audience is, you know where to place more of an emphasis. Because if you're talking to somebody who really doesn't think that they're bad, the people that say things like, well, I'm not Hitler. It's like, I didn't do anything that wrong.
I'm more of a Mussolini type.
Exactly. When that is where your benchmark is, Christianity can seem very odd because it's talking a lot about something that you miss. But when you understand that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, when you realize that there is something in you that is not good. And Lewis has wonderful things to say about this in other parts of the book. He says, it's only when a man really tries to be good that he realizes actually how bad he is. Mm. Or to my own personal analogy is, you only realize how important food is in your life when you start to try and diet or fast.
Yeah, exactly.
And then you lie awake at night dreaming of croissant. Anyway.
Yeah.
But yeah,
dreaming of what?
Croissant. Oh, sorry, a croissant.
I understand that you say it differently, but you sounded French. Do you say it the French way?
Croissant. That's the word.
Okay.
And it's definitely not a chocolate croissant. It's a pain au chocolat.
Croissant. See, this is not only is this America versus British, this is Southern America versus British. So I got yelled at the other day. I host trivia at a local bar. It has nothing to do with anything. But actually, it kind of does, because it has the name of our author today. But it was a question about Superman, and I kept saying Lewis and Clark and they were like, I would have gotten the answer right if you said Lois. I'm like, that's what I said. Because Lewis and Lois are loose. Oh man.
Yeah, they crossed America and found kryptonite.
Yeah, exactly.
Anyway, dragging us back to this. So yes, So Lewis does make the point, and you see this actually a lot in his personal correspondence, because what he had done is prior to Mere Christianity, prior to the broadcast talks, he'd actually been traveling around England giving talks at RAF bases. So people that were going to be going up into the air fairly shortly to fight the Germans in the Battle of Britain. And this is one of the things that he found out. He found out that actually a lot of people don't have a concept that they actually need a savior, or that there is any problem with humanity that needs fixing. And so he saw from that you actually do need to instill in people that there is an idea of sin. Chesterton actually does something very similar in his book Orthodoxy, although there he talks about madness instead. Because, as Lewis said in the quotation that I gave earlier, if you don't know you're sick, you're not going to listen to the doctor. You're not going to take your medicine. But when you at least have a concept of that, you're going to be a little bit more docile to the advice of an expert.
Right. All right, I'm gonna list off. We're gonna get through like 3 or 4 of these quickly.
Okay.
Because I'm gonna list off. These are the things that absolutely punched me in the chest. I'll read them all off as maybe direct quotes, but I was paraphrasing, listening to an audiobook, so close enough, right? If you search for truth, you will find truth and comfort. If you search for Jesus, you will find Jesus and comfort. If you search for comfort, you will find neither and dismay. Incredible wording there. Those in famine think a lot about food. I was like, yeah. And I was like, but so do gluttons. I'm like, damn it. That's me. You're right. Forgiveness is a lovely idea until we have something to forgive. So like those were the 3 that I was like, crap. He knows exactly who I am. He never met me, but he has, What do you think? Which is your favorite of those?
Oh, definitely the one about forgiveness. That entire chapter, that's the repeated gut punch. Because he walks people through it. And again, this is why I think it's important to have a little bit of context for the book. He's writing this in World War II and it's being published in the aftermath. Right. You have had this widespread devastation. You've had nations hating each other. You've had a race of people that there was an attempted genocide of them. And now Lewis has a chapter talking about forgiveness. And that's it. He says it's a lovely idea. Everyone loves the idea of forgiveness until they have something to forgive. It's like the moral law. I might deny that there exists an objective moral law until it's violated in terms of me. Until someone has taken my parking spot. Until someone has hurt me in some way. Then suddenly I find this moral law. And it's the same thing with forgiveness. It's a lovely idea until I actually have to do the hard work of forgiving. And I'd actually say that is one of the real golden chapters of this book. Because Lewis walks through it, first of all, how people might be saying to me, how would you feel if you were, say, one of the Poles, or one might say one of the Jews who had suffered under the Nazis? How would you feel then? He says, well, I might feel differently, but that actually doesn't change what Christianity actually says. Jesus says, forgive others, and he says, and if you don't forgive, you won't be forgiven. Boom. It's there. We can't get out of it.
Right. Yeah.
And so this is how it works. And he's got lots of very practical advice on that forgiving. The idea that it's not just a one and done. It's not just like, oh, I've forgiven that person. I never have to think about it again. Because you might find yourself a little bit later realizing that you've had a train of thoughts that's heading down a very bad spot where you're hating that person again. So you have to forgive them again. That this is a muscle that you have to sometimes return to again and again. And he also distinguishes 2 very important things. You find this throughout Lewis, the difference between truth and feelings. He says, you might not feel like you want to forgive somebody, sure, but you should. So do as much of that act of the will as you possibly can. And he says, you're going to have to keep dealing with the feelings as they come up. But it's the same in loving. I love my wife. I love my kids. Sometimes I don't actually have the fluffy feelings that make me want to get up in the middle of the night to deal with a kid that wants me or is demanding cheese at 2 a.m., which is what my son does. You can tell we live in Wisconsin.
What a glutton.
But it's an act of the will. And Lewis comes back to this again and again. It's about choosing. And you let your feelings catch up when they're ready. But you know what Christianity is, and you know what is best for you and the other person. And in this case, it's forgiveness.
Beautiful. Beautiful. The next one is a similar on the forgiveness thing. So I'll share this while we're here. He says, this whole idea of hate the sin, but love the sinner, and how, or he says, I've been doing that for myself my whole life, right? Because he's asking the question, I've heard it said, hate the sin and love the sinner. How do I do that? And then he had this realization, like, oh, I've been doing that for myself. I have chosen to hate the sin once I realized that this thing was sinful and I'm not supposed to do it. Okay, I can hate the sin. I didn't hate myself. I didn't give up on myself completely, right? Where like, it's way harder to do that. It's like, David and I were close and we were friends and we did podcasting together, and then he was mean to me and then like, and then I'm like, oh, I hate David. It's like, no, buddy, like you've done way worse stuff to yourself, and you've forgiven yourself and you still love yourself. So I just thought that was I just never thought about it that way. It's like, I've literally been practicing doing this my whole life because I think pretty highly of myself. And yet when one person does one thing slightly wrong, I'm like, they suck now. They just went from a 10 down to a 5. And I'm like, what am I doing? Right.
Yeah. You've been practicing it your entire life for one person.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
and the other thing that you do for yourself is also you make accommodations. You understand. It's like, I was snappy with my wife there, but I had been up for most of the night with the children, right, and I hadn't had food yet, and I hadn't had my morning tea. It still wasn't good, but I can understand why I did that a little bit more. And Lewis says, both here and in his letters, he says, I should be doing that more for other people and less for myself.
Right.
I should be less accommodating, not quite so quick to give the excuses for why something was bad or the circumstances why my culpability might not be at its maximum. But I should be doing that for other people more and less for myself.
All right. I think we're getting into the last section here.
Okay.
And then I'll let you have the last word on anything that we missed here. So, last section. I actually have quite a bit. I think I took more notes in the last section than I did anything else. But
deep waters.
Yeah, for sure. So one of the let's hop right into the deep waters, right? The one that I've been thinking about the most, because I think it is the most conceptually hard for me to deal with. A lot of these things, like I mentioned, the gut punch things, it's like they're very clear. They're very difficult, but they're very clear, like painfully clear, right? But the one that I was thinking about was he was talking about a pushback against prayer. Like, why should we even pray? You know, like how does God even answer prayer? I have asked this question hundreds and hundreds of times and never really gotten a great answer, but I've gotten answers that have gotten me 1% to 2% closer to probably what, some sort of understanding, right? And I feel like this next thing from him was one of them. So he says that God, because he's outside of time, he is experiencing everything at one moment. So at one moment, he's experiencing my best moment. He's experiencing my worst moment. He's hearing my prayer request. He's watching his son suffer on the cross. He's watching creation. He's watching Hitler. He's watching David Bates be born. He's watching Cleopatra hang out with Antony. Like he's experiencing it all at one moment because he's outside of time. And that was actually really helpful when it came to like my prayer requests, because I'm like, God, I need help now, or man, I really wanted to pray for this and I forgot about it, or all these kind of things, right? Where, and he was even talking about like why does my request even matter? I've been dealing with this a lot lately. It's like we've been trying to sell our house, and I've been feeling really bad about asking for prayer for God's help in selling our house, because I'm like, why does he care? Like, right, because I imagine it like a phone line. I think probably because of Bruce Almighty, the great theological movie Bruce Almighty, where God's receiving all of these requests at once, and one person can't handle all of that, and he's like, Taylor wants to sell his house, and yet, there's these people in Africa who are suffering. It's like, hey, listen to them. I'm not even going to ask. I don't want to tie up the phone line, right? Where God isn't. He can't be bombarded, first of all, right? But also because helping my human mind understand it, it's because he's outside of time. And so he can't be bombarded because he's seeing it all at one time. I don't know. I've been wrestling with it, but also thinking about, like, that's probably the thing that I've thought about the most since finishing this book.
And Lewis is drawing from the classical tradition here, from Boethius and Augustine, many, many others. He gives the word picture. He describes it as like a line that's on a page, and God can see the entire line, and that line is your lifetime, and he sees the entire thing here and now. And that was he was giving this explanation in reference to the person that would object to prayer, insofar as, how could God listen to so many all at once? And rather than just say leaning on divine omnipotence, he says he's outside of time, so he has as much time to spend with you as if you were the only person in the entire world. And that is incredibly comforting, that God isn't just on this journey along with us. He sees the beginning from the end. He is the Alpha and the Omega. And that means that he sees it all in the here and now.
All right. The last ones are about fixing ourselves and how we need to improve as people as we say yes to Jesus, and then we need to get closer to Jesus. All right. I'm going to do kind of what I did earlier with the gut punch ones, and I'm going to read a bunch of them in a row, and then you're going to pick what you like out of them, and we're going to talk about that. All right. Here we go. Okay. First one. God becoming human is a much bigger difference than us becoming a slug or cockroach. I just really liked that mental image. It's like, I don't want to become a slug, and yet he became like infinitely worse than slug compared to being a God. When it comes to the parts of us that are not like Christ, there's a few quotes here. All the negative parts of us are doomed to death, but we are not. All of our sin, all of our sufferings are doomed to death, but we are not. I have not come to torment your natural self, but to kill it. I was like, God dang. I thought he was going to say, I have not come to torment your natural self, but to bring you that comfort you asked for in chapter 1. No, I came to kill it. I'll give you a new self instead, myself. I'm like, man, just this Lewis at his best. And then the last one here, nothing within you that has not died will be raised from the dead. Just just like, again, he's putting the screws in, but it kind of feels good. Like it's this weird combination of things.
There's imagery in the Chronicles of Narnia as to what he's doing to you here. It's from The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. Eustace Clarence Scrubb, who also has a terrible name like Clive Staples Lewis, he is this horrible little boy who is the antagonist for a good portion of the book. And they come to one island and he finds a hoard of dragon's gold and he falls asleep on it. And the horrible little person that he was inside then becomes manifested and he becomes this dragon. And
sounds awesome.
Then it is, apart from he now can't talk and he realizes how ugly he is. Whereas before he thought of himself as a very good person. But he is then transformed back into a boy later in the book by Aslan. And what Aslan does is he takes his claws and scrapes off all of the scales. And Eustace describes it as this horrible pain, but there's also good. It's a purging. And since Lewis believed in purgatory as well, this was a very common idea you find throughout his works, that sometimes what is most healing for us is for something to be purged from us, for something to die. And in several of those examples that you gave there, it's this idea of death, and you find it not only in mere Christianity, but in Till We Have Faces, The Great Divorce. There's a line in Till We Have Faces that says, "Die before you die, there's no time after." The idea that there are elements of ourselves that just have to be put to death. But that there's this great exchange, because what Jesus does is he comes with something else that is going to take its place. Earlier in Mere Christianity, he talks about this Zoe life, this divine life that is brought to you, and it's nothing less than sharing the very life of God. For theology nerds, that's called theosis. And so it's that transformation. You find it in all of his books. The Great Divorce, which is my favorite, you see those things come to their full fruition. You see people who have not put the worst parts of themselves to death, and they've clung on to their hellish souvenirs, even at the cost of losing heaven. But you also see those who are willing to submit their worst parts to the divine physician. And sometimes what he's going to mandate is an amputation. We're not just going to make it nice, we're actually going to get rid of this part. And the ending of Mere Christianity is really powerful, because Lewis says that in this great exchange, we win. Yeah. We don't lose anything really. Everything that has had to die, anything that's good in the thing that had to die, we're going to get back tenfold. It's going to come to new life in the new country. And if we seek Christ, we'll find him, and with him everything else.
Yeah. Connecting it to my least favorite trilogy in my favorite series of all time, the new movies, the new Star Wars movies. One of the big lines was "Let the past die, kill it if you have to." Right, and I think we could get into the whole Star Wars thing. I think they went too far with it, but that idea is essentially like I heard that refrain in this last piece of Mere Christianity, because it's like, let the past die and kill it if you have to, meaning let the past self, let the natural self die, the parts of me that do desire comfort over Jesus and that desire, sin over virtue. Like those parts don't just need to be like slowly kind of massaged out. No, cut them off. Like let the past die and kill it if you have to. Cut off the arm if you have to. All these things, and I just, kind of full circle connects back to like one of my first issues and kind of struggles was for me, Christianity started when I first became a Christian. It was all boring and bad, and then I met Jesus, and it became joy. So like it was just my personal experience is different than what he's talking about there. But this is my experience of ever since I've said yes to being a Christian, life has gotten harder. Right? Like it's joyful, and the joy gets me through the not happy moments, right? But especially like the last 10 years, man, marriage and kids and being an adult and houses and all finances, all that stuff is the difficulties, is the struggle. And through all of these things, I am feeling myself like I need those scales scratched off, right? Like it's revealing the bad parts in me. And I think too often you said, we like in the whole forgiving yourself thing, like we try to, I make excuses. Oh, I was tired. It's like, no, kill it. Kill it with fire, So it was challenging and kind of a reminder of one of these basic teachings of Christianity of like you were saying, like he He wants to kill the bad parts of ourselves. He loves us. He wants to kill the bad parts and refill those parts with himself out of love. Like, I don't know. All that connecting together was just, like you said, a beautiful ending.
But Lewis is also very clear that this isn't just a self-help project.
Mm-hmm.
He's earlier in the book, he talks about be ye perfect. So when Jesus says be perfect as the Heavenly Father is perfect. And he says that this wasn't just something, he calls it sentimental gas. It wasn't just him talking fluff. He actually means it. But what he means by this is, if you let me, if you allow yourself, if you allow me to work in you, I will make you nothing less than perfect. Because you are called to live for eternity with God in heaven. And so if you will let me, I will do that for you.
Right. Yeah, we're all going to be perfect when we get to heaven. It's just how difficult we want to make it between here and there and how long we want it to take with that old purgatory. So that's all of my thoughts. I want you to wrap us up. What any major themes that I missed? Or if you think we covered it all, what's the last word? What's the last word here, David?
I'll just point to a few other really important parts of the book.
Sure.
One is how Lewis talks about evil. He makes it clear that evil isn't a thing. Again, he's drawing on the Christian tradition all the way back to Augustine and even further back than that. The idea that evil isn't a thing, it is good that has been perverted, seeking something good in the wrong way at the wrong time to the wrong degree. And he says, this is why we call the Satan a fallen angel, because he was at the top of the ladder and he fell the furthest. We haven't mentioned Lewis's trilemma, that Jesus is either a liar, lunatic, or Lord.
Okay, this was another one where I was like, this is so ubiquitous in Christianity. I was like, is this where it started? Is this where you first? Okay, it's not. Okay,
this is why you know it, but This is not where it started.
Okay, it is why I know it though. It was one of those things like I didn't write it down because I was like, I've heard that since I was 12.
Yep, Lewis stole it from Chesterton. It's in Everlasting Man, and Chesterton stole it from those before him. St. Thomas More said the same thing. You can even go back to the New Testament itself, where what did they say of Jesus? Oh, he has a demon. He's a madman. But that's a really important part of mere Christianity and something that's very popularized. People tend to try and push it way too far or put constraints on it that Lewis didn't. And remember, these are 10 or 15-minute talks. He's not going to cover everything.
Right. Yeah.
And we mentioned the new life, but the one thing that I would like to end with, and particularly since you've got a Catholic audience, is one of the things that this book does for a lot of people who aren't Catholic or Orthodox, people that typically don't have a very strong, robust sense of the sacraments, is Lewis very often introduces them to that. So when he's talking about the divine life coming into us, so first of all, he sets it up that we have the natural life that we get from our parents. We didn't ask for it; we just got it. But we're called to maintain it. We can heal to a certain degree, but we still have to go back to a physician to be healed when necessary. He says the spiritual life is very similar to that. We receive it through baptism, usually as a child. We didn't ask for it, we just got it. We're called to nurture this life that's within us, and sometimes we need to go to a physician. But one of the points that he makes is that this new life isn't just spread through mere acts of belief, but bodily acts of baptism and Holy Communion. And he has this to say to people that don't really like that sort of talk. He says there's no good trying to be more spiritual than God. God never meant you to be a purely spiritual creature. He says he uses material things like bread and water and wine and oil to put this new life in us. And he says we might think this is crude and unspiritual. And he says God doesn't. He invented eating. He likes matter because he invented it.
Right. He spit in the dirt and put it on a dude's eyes. He could have just been like, snap your fingers. He didn't even have to snap your fingers. You just look at him. Yeah, you're healed. Yep. He's like, nah, I'm going to spit in the dirt and I'm going to put it on your face. That's great. All right, David, I kept you longer than I said, but that's not a surprise to either of us, I would imagine.
Not at all.
Neither of us have ever been known to be long-winded, so you put us together. All right. Pints of Jack podcast. It is wherever you listen to podcasts, on YouTube. Why should they listen?
Because who doesn't want to be part of a great book club? And if you don't have one locally, you can be part of ours virtually. We publish episodes at least once a week, often twice a week. And we've got a website, pintsofjack.com, full of resources. And it's a really good on-ramp if you've started reading a bit of Lewis and you either feel there's more there to dig out or you want to talk about it with some friends, you can do it with us.
Great. That's awesome. Thanks for being here on our end. We've got a weekly podcast about Catholic comedy and entertainment. David's been on that show a bit. If you want to see a Lewis versus Tolkien conversation, we did that on the podcast. I'll link that down below. We've also got here in this series, Catholic Perspective, we've got other books. I recently did one that had a cuss word in it. That was fantastic. Other books, other TV shows, other movies. Our reviews is essentially like this, but a little less smart because I don't have a smart British person on all of those. So thank you guys for watching with us today. I really appreciate it. Make sure that you hit subscribe. Go subscribe to Pints with Jack, and thanks for being with us today. Bye, David.